So in this video, we're going to have a look at some of both the political and also the economic arguments in terms of why governments do intervene in international trade. Let's start with the political arguments. The first and by far the most common is to protect jobs and industries. And a lot of the time the reasons why governments move to protect certain industries and the jobs obviously located within them is a result of the political pressures from large groups such as unions or industries that are perceived to be threatened, typically by more efficient overseas producers, that is, companies that are importing cheaper products into the country, which make it difficult for those local industries and producers to actually survive and compete against them. Now, these pressure groups often have more political clout than the consumers, and we'll talk in a few slides' time about how a lot of these moves, these political arguments, actually end up being helpful to the producer, but not necessarily great for the consumer. And we'll talk about why that's the case, as I say, in a few slides' time. A good example here is the Australian car industry. Up until recently, there was a situation where the Australian car industry comprised at least a number of different manufacturers. Unfortunately, as of last year, there are now no longer any local car manufacturers here in Australia. And a large reason why for so long there was even such an industry was because it not only was it ingrained in the Australian psyche and part of our national identity to be able to produce cars, but there was significant pressure from the unions involved there. Almost every worker who was part of that local manufacturing industry also belonged to one of the unions, and together they were able to exert significant influence and pressure on the Australian government to maintain that industry. And as I say, it was only as of last year that the government finally said we can't continue to justify propping up and supporting, from a financial perspective, the local manufacturers. So saving the jobs and maintaining that job as well as the overall industry was a key part of why the government did so and continued to financially support and subsidise that industry for a long time. The second reason here is for national security. There are certain industries within a nation which are typically deemed important for things relating to national security. So we see industries such as the aerospace, advanced electronics, and especially weapons and defence being often protected by the government. That is, that they step in or intervene in free trade to ensure that they have at least some control over those industries because they're deemed so important for the country's security. And we saw an example of that here in Australia recently, where the government decided that it was going to invest and subsidise the manufacturing of submarines as part of Australia's Defence Force, our Navy, here in Australia, to ensure that we had control over that within the country. There were a few question marks raised over how viable and how worthwhile this was, given that the figure that the government invested to ensure that these submarines would be manufactured in Australia, despite the fact that they were actually designed overseas, was a small sum of 50 billion Australian dollars. So clearly the government has invested a lot of not only effort but financial resources into protecting these local industries, and whether that's worth it long term, there are still question marks over that type of decision. Another political argument for government intervention is to retaliate, and typically this is against foreign governments. So sometimes we see local governments taking, or at least threatening to take, specific actions in response to what is deemed to be unfair foreign competition. A lot of the time the threatened governments may then remove trade barriers, or sometimes they won't back down. So it's not guaranteed that it will work, these moves, this retaliation by the local government, but it does happen a fair bit, and sometimes tensions can escalate and we actually see additional and new trade barriers being enacted in the latter case. So we saw an example here a few years ago between the Chinese and US governments in relation to intellectual property rights. And as we've talked about in a few previous videos, in China the upholding and the level of detail in a lot of intellectual property rights related laws and legislation is not quite as stringent as it is in a lot of Western countries. And certainly the US had an issue with a lot of Chinese firms being able to effectively copy, or to a certain extent at least rip off, a lot of the US firms' designs. And so they retaliated against this lack of action and this lack of stringent laws in relation to this issue by imposing new trade barriers and sanctions against China at that particular time. So it's often a move to try and pressure a foreign government into doing something that the local government would like it to do. The next argument is to protect consumers, and this is especially the case when there are so-called dangerous or unsafe products that might be imported into a particular country that the government wants to either cease completely that importing, or at least put restrictions to protect the people within its country. So we've got a few examples here. Mad cow disease, and it's a while ago now, but there was a time when a lot of the British beef and European beef exports were actually cancelled because there were restrictions put on those beef imports by a number of different countries' governments, because they didn't want these potentially diseased livestock entering their country and potentially endangering their consumers. We saw the same sort of thing with bird flu in another number of Asian countries where restrictions were enforced there, so that a lot of these livestock and the chickens and poultry related produce was not able to be imported into a lot of countries given the concerns over that dangerous and harmful flu, and also the issue of genetic re-engineering. A couple more political arguments here. Furthering foreign policy objectives is another fairly common one here, and this involves preferential trade terms that may be granted to countries where a government would like to build a stronger relationship with that country. So it makes sense, you know, you say, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, we'll give you preferential trade treatment if it means that you do the same to us. And we see this happening fairly commonly. Trade policy can also be used to go the other way and to actually punish rogue states. So when Vladimir Putin and his Russian colleagues came marching in on the back of bears, okay, maybe it didn't quite go down like that, but when they did involve themselves in the conflict around Crimea and what happened in the Ukraine, a lot of the Western nations like the US were not happy with their involvement in that conflict and actually imposed trade sanctions to punish them, so to speak, for that involvement. There's also the argument that governments should intervene in trade to protect human rights, so using trade policy to protect the human rights of individuals in particular countries. And we've seen a number of examples of this as well. So a few decades ago there were sanctions put in place by a number of different governments against the South African government for its role in the apartheid, which is an infamous part of South Africa's history that involved the mistreatment of many different ethnicities, and some in particular. And also we actually saw that from a practical level and from a very sort of visible perspective, when a lot of the cricketing nations, the governing bodies of the cricketing nations, actually kicked South Africa out of the international cricket competition. So a lot of the governing bodies, supported by the federal governments, actually said that we're not okay with South Africa being involved in the business of cricket, given the atrocities that were taking place. And you can see evidence of that in the bottom right corner of your screen. There was a similar situation where the UNHCR voted against Sri Lanka, given the additional crimes against human rights that were being committed in that particular country not that long ago as well. The final political argument is in relation to the protecting of the environment. As we've talked about in previous videos, there's now very much a global awareness of the need for all countries around the world to work together to ensure that there is a sustainable element for the environment moving forward. And we've seen the creation of policies and protocols like the Kyoto Protocol. And what we've tended to find is that those nations and countries which have become involved in those types of global agreements have often been given preferential trade treatment by the other members of those policies, while those countries that haven't signed up have often been given, if not direct trade restrictions, at least not been given that preferential treatment. So there's this focus now beyond things like human rights and furthering foreign policy. It's actually based around environmental goals and desires as well now. Alright, let's now have a look at a couple of the economic arguments for government intervention. And the first that we're going to look at here is the infant industry argument. And this says that an industry, at least in theory, should be protected until it can develop and be viable and competitive internationally. And this is actually accepted as a justification for at least temporary trade restrictions by the WTO, especially for those developing nations. And it's important to not forget here that the WTO exists to actually abolish, in general, government intervention and involvement in trade. So the fact that even they are willing to accept this shows that it is generally a well recognised and accepted means and justification for intervention by the government. It's this idea, and if you imagine it, you've got a young industry, it's only just starting, it's like an adorable little puppy, and they actually are my adorable little puppies. There they are, Nigel and Gordon. Just like these adorable puppies, the industries, when they're young and when they're little, they need a bit of support. You need to nurture them as parents, or in this case as the government. You need to make sure that they're able to grow up big and strong. And once, hopefully, they do become bigger and stronger, they can then stand up on their own 2 feet, and in this case, compete on an international scale. I should have said on their own 4 feet, shouldn't I, for the puppies. It does raise the question, though, of when does an industry become grown up? So, with your puppies, at some point you expect them to become a little bit more mature and stop being naughty pugs like this. Oh no, we don't want that. Eventually your industries and your puppies are supposed to become mature and be able to be relied upon without you needing to supervise their every move. And it's the same within international business. So if a country has the potential to develop a viable competitive position, shouldn't its firms actually be capable of raising the necessary funds without that continuing support from the government? And this is especially the case long term. A lot of people say that if it's going to be able to be successful for a while, it shouldn't need much support to be internationally competitive. An interesting example here is a comparison of the Brazilian and Australian automotive industries. Unlike the Australian car manufacturing industry, which, as I said before, is now defunct, there are no more local manufacturers, the Brazilian car industry is going from strength to strength. And the main reason why it is doing so is because it has significant financial support, subsidies and protection by the local government, by the Brazilian federal government. And a lot of people in Australia said, why couldn't the Australian government give the same support to the Australian car manufacturers so that we too could continue to have a local industry? It does beg this question, though, of should it not be able to stand up without that support from the government? When are you able, if ever, as a government to step away and say, okay, we don't need to give this continued assistance? It's a debate which continues to go on within academic circles in international business today. The final argument for government intervention we're going to look at today is in relation to strategic trade policy. Now, you might recall a week or two ago when we looked at the international business trade theories, the new trade theory touched on this important issue of first mover advantages and outlined how important they are for ensuring firm and indeed a nation's industry its success on the global playing field. And so there is an argument here to say here that in cases where there may be important first mover advantages, governments should help those firms from their own countries attain those advantages. And that was certainly the case with the US government and its assistance for Boeing when Boeing became one of now effectively only 2 major manufacturers of aeroplanes back in the 50s and the 60s. A large part of that was because the government subsidised them and supported them so that they could enter the market first and they could become one of the dominant players and gain access to those first mover advantages. On the other hand, governments can also help firms overcome those same barriers, those same barriers to entry that are created through first mover advantages, where foreign firms have that initial advantage. So, for example, just looking at the same industry here, the governments of Great Britain, France, Germany and Spain came together and decided that to enable their own industries to compete against the US Boeing company, they would come together and create the Airbus company. And you can see down there that the different parts of Airbus aircraft are made all over those 4 different countries. So there is certainly an argument for government intervention to help firms either attain or even overcome those key first mover advantages.